So without losing more time, I'm going to introduce the first speaker of the day, who is Clemens Krueger from Edinburgh Napier University, presenting his paper using Amazon Alexa APIs as a source of digital evidence. So all the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining my presentation. Yeah, as you said, my name is Clemens, and I recently graduated from Edinburgh Napier University with a master's degree in advanced security and digital forensics. And my topic for today, as you can see, is using Amazon Alexa APIs as a source of digital evidence, which consists of research I did as part of my dissertation. My co-author, Sean McKeown, was also my supervisor for the dissertation, and he supported me a lot during all of this. You could have already heard him earlier before the break. He just gave a talk himself. So let's get into it. Yeah, okay. So basically, let's have a look at the Amazon Alexa ecosystem. So as you can see, you have, with Amazon Alexa, you have Echo X Alexa enabled devices such as the Echo or the Echo Dot that interact with the Alexa cloud and interact with the user. The user interacts with those devices using voice commands. And to be able to record those voice commands, the Echo is constantly recording, constantly listening, and waiting for the so-called wake word. So for example, the default wake word is Alexa. So once it spots that, it starts recording. And once the command is over, the audio is sent to the Amazon cloud to be processed there, and then the results are sent back. You also have other devices on the client side there. As you can see, you have the so-called companions, which are smartphones, tablets, laptops, and so on, that have the Alexa app or the Alexa website, that can access the Alexa app or the Alexa website, which can be used to kind of manage the Echo devices you have in your account. So you can change settings, you can interact with the device in a visual manner instead of through audio, and so on. These devices connect to and communicate with the same cloud, as you can see there. And then on the right side, you can see you also have a bunch of third-party kind of integrations that are possible with devices and applications. So for example, you could control your smart light bulbs, you could connect them to Alexa, and you could control them through voice commands with your Echo device. But that's not really the topic for today. The topic is kind of the left side. I'm focusing on the red parts there. So generally, the problem with all of this is that it's not really clear what Amazon does with the data, with the recordings that are sent to the cloud, and how much is sent to the cloud and what is stored and so on. There's not much information on that. There actually have been reports that Amazon employees actively listen to voice recordings in order to, for example, well, the reason that was given was to improve the voice recognition capabilities. But it's still a strange thought that, you know, someone is sitting there and listening to your audio recordings. So the goal of this, the general goal, is to find out more about what data about a certain user is stored by Amazon on the Amazon servers. And the focus here was specifically the red arrows. You can see the communication between the Echo devices and the Amazon cloud, or the companion devices and the Amazon cloud. And this communication, as you can see in the title, is done through a set of API endpoints that the devices access and use to communicate with the cloud. And the general idea for this was kind of to try and learn more about the data that is stored there by first populating a device, an Echo device, simulated with kind of realistic simulated user data by actually just using the device, and then accessing that same data through the APIs and just kind of seeing what parts of it are stored, what metadata is in there, how is it stored, etc. And you know, let's have a look into how that was done. So basically, the first step, as I said, was generating a data set. So in order to analyze all that, I needed to have an Echo device that actually contained, or the Alexa account that contained realistic data. So what I did was I crafted a list of interactions and actions to do with the Echo device, so specific voice commands, specific interactions with the app, changing settings, etc., in order to kind of try and use all the functionality that the Echo provides in a controlled manner with a controlled kind of data set. And this was actually done on two different devices with two different device types, because I wanted to find out whether the hardware that is used to interact with Alexa, whether that influences the data that is stored or the data that's processed. So I had an Amazon Echo Dot of the second hardware generation and one of the third generation, and I populated them with the exact same data set in the same order, the same interactions, everything as close as I possibly could. Obviously, there were some differences in time because I had to do one after the other, but in general, it was as close as possible. And then for both of those, I set up different accounts as well for all those, so that I had different kind of data sets for that. And for both of those accounts, a list of APIs was accessed, the data, the responses retrieved. They were then compared, and also generally the data in them was analyzed, which we'll go through in a minute. So for that data gathering, the first big problem was that for those APIs, there's no official API documentation whatsoever from Amazon's side. So all of that work was exploratory. So the approach that I took was I use a browser to access the Amazon Alexa cloud through the Alexa webpage, the companion website. And I basically crawled through that site and accessed every menu, every link, everything that I could to trigger as many requests to all the different APIs and all the different areas of that website as I could. And I intercepted all that traffic with a proxy with Burp Suite to be exact. And I set Burp Suite to filter through that. And I set a filter that only filtered for JSON type data, because I knew that the APIs in general return data in the JSON format, and also only coming from specifically the AmazonAlexa.com to filter out anything that might be around there to get rid of false positives. And Burp Suite makes it possible to store all that data in a file automatically. So that's what I did to be able to analyze that further. And I did this twice, once with the second generation device and once with the third generation device. Now, the next problem that I had with that was that I needed to clean up that data, because the XML file with all that intercepted data that Burp Suite generated was a huge file. It contained all the HTTP requests going to the site and all the responses coming from the site, including all metadata and everything. So that was far too big and far too much unnecessary data. In total, I had about 1 megabyte of text, and with text, that's a lot. And it's basically impossible to go through that in a meaningful way and analyze that. And the second problem was to actually be able to really analyze that data. The file structure that I had was way too complex, because the file that Burp Suite generated was an XML file containing different sections for every single request, HTTP request, and every single HTTP response with all the metadata and everything. And within all those responses, I had separate JSON structures embedded that contained the actual data. So I had different data formats as well, which made it very hard to go through that in a meaningful way. Now, to clean that up, I wrote a Python script, first of all, that transformed or converted that format into a better readable format, which you can basically see on the side. So this is a kind of a representation of that. The end result was one JSON file that contained a list of requests and responses, where the request had only one argument, or had only one parameter, which was the URL of the request, so the API URL, and the response contained the JSON response data from that API. So I had one big JSON that was a lot cleaner and didn't have all the unnecessary network protocol overhead that was in the Burp Suite capture. And then the second cleanup part I did was I manually removed a lot of unnecessary data. So there was some metadata in there. There was some empty responses, so APIs that didn't actually respond with any data that I could remove because they weren't useful for me. There were a lot of duplicates in there. There were some false positives that weren't actually APIs as well at all. So I cleaned all of that up, and I got a much smaller and much better readable file that I could actually analyze. And yeah, so the first bit of analysis I did was actually looking at the differences between the two data sets that I got from those two different device generations. So as I said, I used the second generation and the third generation Amazon Echo Dot. And I wanted to determine if there are any meaningful differences in there. And on the right side there, you can see a table with all the differences between the two generations that I could actually find in the files. And as you can see, there are not many. There's a few IDs that are different. You know, items in lists that are different. You have items in different order, and of course you have, you know, expected things like the device type, which is different, or the serial numbers, account IDs, and so on, because I had different Alexa accounts for each one to have a fresh kind of account for each. Obviously those differed as well. So all those are expected differences, and they're only very small differences that are not really relevant for this context, which leads me to the conclusion that the hardware in general does not seem to impact the stored data in any meaningful way. That also implies that, because, you know, all those APIs and everything that's going to come after this, the analysis, all this is exploratory work. So it's not clear if in the future Amazon might change the structure of those APIs, and that research needs to be done again. So this kind of implies at least that there's some consistency to the API across device generations, which might also, you know, imply that in the future this might hold up and not have to be done again and again to adjust for changes by Amazon. Now after that, I continued with only one of the two datasets because I determined that they're basically the same anyway. So I used the dataset of the third generation device. And the first thing I want to clarify here is that to access any of the responses, any of those APIs for a certain account, it's necessary to actually have the Alexa account credentials. So for this, so if you were to think from a forensic point of view, if someone wants to investigate someone else or wants to find out more about the user of a certain Echo device or an Alexa account, the assumption I'm making for all of this is that that person has already gotten access to the account credentials. There has been some research into, for example, trying to get credentials from cached storage on an Echo device, things like that. There has been some research into that, but that's not my area at this. So I'm assuming that this has already happened for this. Now on the right, you can see there was a long list. Those are all the APIs that were uncovered by this crawling. So all the lists that are kind of at least that are used by the companion website. And many of them return actually quite useful data that gives a lot of insight into the person that uses the account, but we'll go into that in a minute. Generally, if you want to look at the actual results, the actual data sets that I recovered for this research, you can use the link in the presentation here that links to my GitHub repository where I stored both the raw data sets for both the devices and my cleaned up versions. So if you want to have a look at that in more detail, go ahead and you can access them there. But now what I want to do is I want to look at a few of those API responses in detail and just show you what information is contained there and what conclusions might be drawn from that. So the first is the so-called activities API. I've printed the links here for all the API URLs, but I'm not going to say them now. The first is the activities API, which returns, if accessed, returns a list of all the previous voice interactions with Alexa. So everything that you said to Alexa and you got a response for will be in that list. Those data sets contain a transcript of the command. So your actual, what you said to what questions you asked or what requests you made in text form. You have timestamps for that. You have some device information about which device was used to issue the command. And you also have the response that Alexa gave you for that request. So if you ask the question, the answer will be in that response field. And also there's a so-called utterance ID, which is very interesting. It's an ID that links to the actual audio recording that of the command that you issued. I'll go into that in a bit more detail later, but that's a very interesting thing. So depending on, I mean, all of this is depending on how actively a user uses the Alexa and how truthfully he enters data and everything. So that all of that kind of depends on the actual person. But all of this information might already give you a good insight if the user uses that device regularly into the user's behavior, their habits, depending on the questions or the queries they ask, possible whereabouts, if traffic information is asked or things like that. There might be very interesting indicators in there. Another very interesting API is the Contacts API. If you access that API, you get a response with a list of all the contacts in the address book of the Alexa account that's currently logged in. So that includes, as you might expect, names, phone numbers, emails, postal addresses, etc., whatever you want to store about a person. And you can, as a user, you can enter accounts manually for this. This is possible, and that might already give you a good insight into the environment of a person, of the account's owner. But also, and that's, I think, much more interesting, if you use the companion app on a smartphone, when you set up a device, the app will ask you for permission to access the phone's contacts, the phone's address book. And if you give that permission, all the contacts from that smartphone will be uploaded to the account and will be accessible through that API. So possibly even if you don't have access to a suspect's phone, you could still access all their contacts and contact information in their address book through this, if he did that. And I mean, it's just one click, so most people will probably do that out of convenience and just say, yes, I will allow that, and do that. Another interesting API is the Device Preferences API. So what that does is it returns information about all the Echo devices, or generally the devices that are registered to this account. It has some additional information such as serial numbers, the device type, the account ID, but also there might be location details in there. There might be language settings, so time zone information and so on. All of this information is manually entered. So again, when you set up an account and you set up a device with that account, you are asked to provide certain information such as your location and your time zone settings. So that again needs to be kind of taken with a grain of salt, but it's possible. If it might again be an indicator as to where's, give more information about someone, about the account owner. And it can also be useful for identifying further devices. If you have currently only know about one device, but you can access the account through that and then get more information about other devices that that person uses, that might give you a broader kind of target range for analysis. The next API I want to talk about is called Device Wi-Fi Details. And as you might expect, it gives you information, it returns information about all the wireless networks that the devices that are registered to the account are currently in or have stored. So you can store networks to an account. And that includes the information about the device's MAC address, which can be very interesting, the serial number and the device type again, but also it contains the network's SSID, the stored network's SSID, which again might be an indicator for example, for where that user has been if the device was logged into a certain Wi-Fi network, for example. Again, this might not be, might not be a definitive information, but it might be an indicator for something. Another API that's very similar to the device preferences API that I mentioned before is the devices v2 API. Where the v2 comes from, I don't know. That one is similar to the device preferences, but it returns more technical data about the registered devices. So again, you get the MAC address there, but you also get the device family, you get the software version and the device type. So, you get some additional information, especially the software version in there. It also shows you whether the registered devices are online at the moment. So if they're currently connected to the Amazon cloud at that moment, and also if they're being charged at that moment. So if they're, plugged in. And also what it shows you is a friendly name that can be given to the device by a user. So you can, if you, for example, have an Echo device in multiple Echo devices in multiple rooms in your house, you can give them names to indicate which ones they are. So that can also be accessed through this. And I think especially the software version is a very interesting information at this point, because it might be useful to identify vulnerabilities, for example, for that specific software version, to gain access to those devices and to, again, do further analysis if necessary. And yeah, you can also kind of all those, the device types, serial numbers and stuff like that, all under the names, can also be used to associate those devices that you identified with those APIs with actual hardware devices that were maybe taken or found from that user to kind of identify and associate them. And the last API that I want to talk about now is, as I mentioned before, the utterance API. So this is probably one of the most interesting ones, because it can be used to return, it returns voice recordings, audio recordings of the commands that were issued from the interaction history. So Amazon has actually confirmed in the past that those recordings are kept indefinitely from their side. So it's possible to delete them. The user can delete those recordings, but if you don't actively delete them, they will stay on, they will be kept on Amazon servers indefinitely. And the way this works is that each of those recordings has a so-called utterance ID registered to it, and it is referenced through the activities API that I mentioned in the beginning. So if you have if you have one of those IDs from an API entry, from an entry in the activities, you can add that as a parameter to that API call, and you can actually download the audio recording for that interaction. So your actual voice. And now that, of course, is very, very interesting, because those recordings, can potentially tie an account or a user, kind of a digital user, to a physical person through their voice. That might especially be interesting if the account is used by multiple people, which is also possible. And another very, very interesting aspect there is that the background noise that might be there from those recordings might also contain further information. So for example, if someone is issuing a voice command, but someone else is having a conversation in the background, that conversation might also be picked up from the microphone, by the microphone, and then be stored in that recording, and can then be accessed at a later point in time through that by someone investigating something. So that can give you a lot more information potentially again. So in conclusion about that data analysis, generally you can see potentially this extracted data can give you a lot of insight into a user of that Alexa account. Some of the APIs won't be as relevant, but some of them, the ones I showed, can be. And they can provide a lot of valuable infos about someone, especially considering that a lot of metadata, such as timestamps or device information, or even in some cases location data, is stored with them. So that might be very interesting, and it can kind of expose or give an insight into the user's general behavior and their habits. But of course, all of that depends on how much that user actually interacts with the Alexa account. So if they don't really use it often, or if they just not really use it seriously, then that might not be very useful. But the more interactions there are, the bigger picture you get about someone. And now before I finish, I wanted to look at one last aspect of all of this, and that's kind of an aspect from the user privacy, from a user privacy point of view. So I realized when I looked at especially the voice recordings and this interaction history, that there are different ways to delete entries from an account from this interaction history. So deleting the entries and the voice recordings as well. And I wanted to look at how those different ways of deleting that differ, and then also look at if the actual data is actually deleted or if you can still recover it somehow. So what I did was I issued a specific voice command, for example, as you can see on the top right there, asking about traffic, something like that, 3 times. And then I deleted each one of those with a different method, one of those 3, which I'll go through in a second. And then I compared the API result sets before that deletion and after that deletion, to see what was still there and what was actually gone. So the 3 possibilities to delete voice or interaction history entries is, first of all, there's in the settings menu of the Alexa website or the app, there's a history menu where you can see a list of activities, listen to the recordings, and also delete entries from that. You can see that on the bottom right there. You can see, I asked, for example, about the weather and I got the response and all that. So you can see all that interaction there, and you can also delete entries in there, as you can see. Now the second is you can have so-called cards, and I haven't really talked about those before, but basically you can see one of those cards in the top right there. In the app or in the website, for each interaction with, for each voice command, for each interaction with the device, you get one of those cards, which kind of gives you a visual representation of what was asked and what response was given. So in this example, I asked, as you can see, or you might not be able to read, I asked Alexa what the traffic to Glasgow is, and the response was, traffic information and a little map. And you can already see there's some information in there because you might not be able to see it on the map, but the map shows, traffic from Edinburgh to Glasgow, which indicates that I was in Glasgow at that time, which I actually was. And you can delete those cards as well. There's a button to remove those cards. You can remove them separately. And the third setting I looked at was there's a specific privacy menu in the Alexa settings, which has the option to bulk delete that history and the voice recordings up to a certain, so you can enter a timestamp and you can delete recordings up to a certain point if you want. And then I looked at, so I did all those 3 and I looked at how that impacted the actual APIs or the actual, what you can still be able to see. And as you can see in that table there on the left, not all of those actions actually deleted all the information, all the data. So the 4 entries that I checked were from left to right, the activities and the cards API. So there's the activities API that I mentioned before. There's a separate API that returns the results of those cards. So the visual representation that you can see on the top right there. The third I checked was that voice history menu on the bottom right here, as you can see in the menus, in the settings. And the fourth was I checked if the actual utterance ID associated with that activity was still there, was still accessible through that utterance API. And as you can see, for example, that the cards method, so removing that card, literally just removed that card and nothing else, or all the history, all the recordings, everything else was still available through those other means. Again, the privacy settings, which you might expect that they actually delete everything because they're, they focus on a privacy point of view. They only removed the entries from that list in the settings and the actual voice recording. So the voice recording was gone after that, but you can still access the interaction transcripts and everything through those other 2 APIs, the activities and the card. And the only one that actually made it possible to delete all of those was that history menu. When you click on delete in one of those entries, it was actually gone from all of them. So the conclusion I draw from this is that data is stored redundantly on that information, and it can often be reconstructed even if you think it might be deleted. And I think I'm over time now, so I've reached the end of my talk. If there are any questions, if there's time for questions, feel free to ask, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Clemens. There's been quite a lot of interaction in the questions and answers. So we have time just for a quick question. This question is from Andrew. He's asking, having seen how much information Amazon collects on users, should we be concerned about how much information is used to advertising on to us?
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a valid concern because in the end, we don't really know. I mean, this might even just be the tip of the iceberg because that's only, information that I was able to recover through those APIs. And we don't really know what happens with that data, if it's just stored or if it's just used for processing or if it's actually sent to advertisers. So that is a valid concern. Unfortunately, it's very hard to kind of figure out what the situation is there, but I think that's definitely a valid concern.